The events commemorating D-Day continue now on BBC One, as Her Majesty the Queen, other heads of state and veterans of the campaign remember those who took part in the daring airborne assault behind enemy lines and the naval operations at sea.
Good afternoon and welcome back to Normandy. We're located here at Arromanches at the west end of the British and Canadian beaches and at the site of one of the Normandy campaign's most extraordinary inventions, the artificial harbour, the Mulberry Harbour. And down there on the beach, not just chunks of the harbour, but a great gathering of people and World War II equipment. It's a marvellous sight. Now, this Arromanches and the Mulberry Harbour was where the essential supplies were put ashore in the first months after the landings. But all this comes a little later in the story. While most of the attention often goes on the seaborne assault on the beaches, it's very easy to overlook the essential prelude, the preliminary assault from the air. Because in all the bravery of the beach landings, and it was huge, the airborne assault must certainly be seen as among the most risky, the most uncertain, and the most critical to the overall success of the entire D-Day operation. Now, in a few minutes' time, this field outside the village of Ronville will see a mass parachute drop by 1,000 British, Canadian, Polish and French paratroops. The wind has dropped and the weather looks fine. They'll come in 18 Hercules and they'll land on one of the 3 original drop zones designated for the first stages of D-Day. They, of course, will be jumping by day. 50 years ago, their predecessors dropped or landed in gliders by night, jumping or flying into total uncertainty. And no amount of training could prepare them for the confusion of what they would find when they landed. And the success of the operation is all the more extraordinary for that. Now, once that's finished, we'll be going to the middle of the Channel, because earlier this morning, as you may well have seen, a commemorative flotilla of some 15 vessels left the south coast. In mid-Channel, they will rendezvous with the royal yacht Britannia, and observed by the heads of state, including the Queen and President Clinton, who are on board, they will cast wreaths in memory of those who died. And then 2 million poppies will be scattered from a Lancaster bomber in honour of all the servicemen who took part in the operation. But back to the paras. The British and Canadians were dropping on the Allied left flank. 50 miles away, the Americans were to secure the right flank. It was the biggest airborne operation ever attempted. But the Allied Air Commander, Air Marshal Lee Mallory, thought the whole thing highly speculative, and even General Eisenhower was more worried about this than about any other part of the operation. Well, Mike Dewar is in the studio with me to explain these military things. Why was it so tricky, Mike? What is the nature of the problem?
They had to achieve a lot, and all in the hours of darkness. It was a very, very complicated operation, John. But then, of course, airborne forces are a supremely flexible instrument of war. In 1944, they could be inserted by parachute or by glider. They relied less on heavy firepower and much more on stealth and the element of surprise. So it was entirely appropriate that the first troops to land in France on D-Day, only minutes after midnight, should be airborne soldiers of the British 6th Airborne Division and the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. Although they lacked the artillery and armoured support to hold ground for any extended period of time, their role was critical to the success of the seaborne landings. On the left or eastern flank of the attack, the task of the British 6th Airborne was to delay a German counterattack from the east across the River Orne or from the direction of Caen during the vulnerable period before the amphibious operation on Sword gained a firm foothold. In essence, their role was to gain time. In such an ambitious operation, the scope for disaster was immense. Nevertheless, the British operation went well, with the majority of parachutists landing on the designated drop zones and with many gliders landing with uncanny accuracy in the dark precisely on target. A company of Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, led by Major John Howard, landed within 200 yards of their target, the bridge over the Caen Canal, which was later to become known as Pegasus Bridge. Meanwhile, on the right or western flank, The task of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions was to seize the exits through the flooded countryside behind Utah Beach and to prevent German counterattacks on the beachhead. Scattered cloud and German anti-aircraft fire forced the aircraft carrying the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions to deviate from their flight path, resulting in a chaotic drop. Ironically, it was this seeming lack of any pattern to the American operation that confused the Germans, gaining vital time and delaying the movement of reserves. The price paid by the 23,000 British and American airborne troops was terrible: 2,600 Americans and 1,200 British casualties on D-Day alone. But in holding firm for those vital hours, they had performed the classic task of airborne forces, to seize and hold vital ground until relieved.
It was bold, it was essential, but it was an extraordinary achievement, and therefore what happened, the events as they turned out, were even more extraordinary. Let's now join Raymond Baxter.
That is the Pegasus Bridge. It lies rusting and abandoned beside the Caen Canal, which until 7 months ago it spanned. Its future remains obscure. Its past is written in history. But those few tons of steel were the first objective of the entire invasion, for the capture of which British airborne troops fought and died in an action which can only be described as heroic. Now it has been replaced by this, a bridge of similar shape and operation, but wider to cope with the demands of modern traffic. A wry comment, perhaps, on the values of our time. But there, Rob Curling is in touch with today's events. And that is the Café Gondret, the first house in France to be liberated. It remains in the same family ownership and is virtually unchanged since it became the first casualty aid post of the invasion. Nearby, the few hectares of French countryside, unusually open and treeless for Normandy, which were the drop zone for that first critical airborne assault and will be today's DZ. And there, Juliet Morris is waiting. That then is the setting of history and the remarkable sequence of events we are to witness this afternoon. And already the countdown has begun to the 1,000-man massed parachute drop. The spectators are assembled. Above all, the men whose day this is are here, the veterans who fought those gallant actions 50 years ago. And a principal figure amongst them is the man who commanded the glider-borne strike, the coup de main, to capture and hold the Pegasus Bridge before the Germans could destroy it. His 90 men in 3 Horsa gliders were from D Company, the 2nd Battalion, the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, and their support engineers. He is Major John Howard, DSO. In the film The Longest Day, his part was played by Richard Todd.
Release point coming up, Major Howard. Right, prepare for landing.
Major Howard, I cannot overestimate the importance of your task. The Orne River Bridge must be captured before the enemy can destroy it. Your gliders will land at night without the benefit of ground support. You will assault the garrison, overwhelm it, and hold until relieved. Hold until relieved.
As far as Richard playing the part's concerned, well, he was a bit too British officer type for me. You've got to remember, I was a hoi polloi up from the ranks, you know, rough and tumble soldier. And the part I always remembers, and it's part that my blokes to this day pull my leg about, was standing there saying, "Hold until relieved, hold until relieved." Believe me, Michael, there was no bloody time for that. There was too much going on to stand to think about that. Once we cast off, everything was silent, and you could feel your tummies turning over and ready for what was going to be a crash landing. And the one thing I remember so clearly, as I opened that door, I looked down through and I saw these wonderful, lush fields of Normandy. with the wonderful livestock you have in that part of the world, the cattle and the horses, and they're all grazing so quietly. And we were swishing along quietly. They wouldn't have heard us. We weren't singing or anything, but the tranquilizing effect I had on my body was absolutely amazing. And when you come in those gliders, it's an extra tense time because we're going to land in a bumpy field. And the thing we were most afraid of, and everybody is landing a glider, whether it's by day or by night, is an enemy machine gun trained on you. Because if they're waiting for you, you could wipe out all 30 men before you have a chance to fire a shot back. It's a terrible feeling to be as vulnerable as that, I can tell you. The whole of the glider seems to disintegrate around you. There was, even though there'd been some rain, seemed to me to be a hell of a lot of dust and a hell of a damp feeling. The glider pilots, I heard them moaning in the cockpit to my right. I knew that they would have a rough time. The nose of the glider was through wire that was round the German post defences. I'd asked the glider pilots to put the nose of the glider through. They'd never think of one moment they would do it. And they damn well done it. It saved using the Bangalore torpedoes that we used to blow up wire. And the third thing, and perhaps the most important, there was no firing. We had complete surprise. The firing that had started as they ran over the bridge, firing from the hip, started everybody waking up. Now, we knew that was a garrison of 50 defending the bridges. We also knew that in all the villages around to the west of the Caen Canal where German troops were billeted, they always had at least a platoon in a village standing to, ready to jump into lorries and tanks to counterattack vulnerable points like the bridges. And Sandy Smith came up. He was limping rather badly. He whispered that he'd had quite a few casualties, and by this time there was tracer bullet from all directions, both sides of the canal. My chaps firing then. It seemed as if our tracer was yellow and red, and theirs was white and black, blue, and things. It was just like a wonderful firework display. And this went on for about 10 minutes. And that was the attack on the bridge.
Three Lynx Mark 9 light battlefield helicopters of 653 Squadron Army Air Corps, representing the three Horsa gliders of the original group, towed in by Halifax bombers and released at 6,000 feet about 4 miles away offshore. They fly in to commemorate an epic. At 0016 hours, the glider flown by Staff Sergeant Jim Walworth crashed through the perimeter wire at the eastern side of the canal bridge. The lead helicopter approaches that very spot. 15 yards behind him, Staff Sergeant P. Hobbs' glider slewed round and stopped. The third glider, flown by Staff Sergeant G. Barkway, landed 10 yards away in some marshy ground. And as the helicopters hover in those very historic positions, we see the marshy ground where one soldier tragically drowned, becoming the only casualty of the actual landings. And now as they traverse west, we're reminded that the remaining two gliders landed to the west of the bridge over the River Orne. Staff Sergeant R. Howard came to a halt about 300 yards north of the bridge. Staff Sergeant Pearson put his Horsa down in a field 400 yards away. The achievements of the glider pilots and the crews of the Halifaxes, who had towed them in with such precision, was later described by Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory, the Air C&C of the Allied Expeditionary Air Force, as one of the finest pieces of airmanship thus far in World War II. No pilot, least of all myself, would argue with that. Now emerging from the lead helicopter, the hero of the hour himself, Major John Howard, and his pilot, Jim Warwick. With them, that tiny group who arrived those few minutes past midnight to strike that first vital blow. This section of today's commemoration is in the charge of Major Mark Betteridge, the CO of 653 Squadron. There is Major Howard, the men of today's glider pilot regiment replacement, the Army Air Corps. Behind Major Howard, his pilot, Staff Sergeant James Warwick, and what a man he is. He started his airborne war in North Africa, did the Sicilian invasion, which was extremely hazardous from the glider pilot's point of view. For what he and his two colleagues did here, they were awarded an immediate DFM. But James Warwick went on to Arnhem, where he flew a Horsa again, and then to the Rhine crossing, where he flew a big Hamilcar glider with a 7-pounder gun and its crew for the Rhine crossing. His words to describe his Army flying career: short, sharp, a good, clean way to go to war.
Which way are you going now?
Going up that way.
And that brave, small little party is now making its way to the road, the path they blazed in those opening minutes of D-Day. And they will march across their bridge and be saluted by their contemporaries. You will see that there is a certain element of informality here. Casual spectators strolling around, a remarkable degree of freedom apparent in view of the tremendous restrictions which have been placed upon everyone. Major Betteridge had to fight very hard indeed against officialdom to make this happen. John Howard, now over 80, somewhat frail, very exhausted by today's events, but, well, putting a brave face on it would be the understatement of the year. An echo of pipes in the background. We've been hearing those since we arrived in Normandy. And the veterans form up for their march across the Pegasus Bridge. And they will be accompanied by the band of the Army Air Corps, no less their own contemporary comrades. A very proud band, recently formed in these days when so many military bands are being disformed. Major Betteridge, conspicuous in the light blue beret of the Army Air Corps, and he's assisted by his Squadron Sergeant Major, WO2 Chalky, of course, Peters. calling the step, the Sergeant Major calling the step, even for the veterans. There we see the band fallen in to head the parade. And when they march across the bridge, they will be saluted by General St. John Simon Little, the director of the Army Air Corps, the ultimate boss. You see the striking structure of the new bridge. But as I said, in operation and shape, it is extraordinarily similar to that historic relic which it has replaced. Indeed, if you hadn't seen the both, I think it would be very difficult to tell the difference. And immediately below that huge spanning structure to the left of the bridge is the site of the gun nest with a 20mm cannon in it, which was the greatest single threat to this body of men. And Jim Warwick is once again piloting his old boss, Major Howard. And the man over Jim's left shoulder is Jeff Barkway, his fellow pilot, both wearing the Distinguished Flying Medal, which they were awarded immediately after their action. Crowds have been assembling here since early this morning, but I say again, an extraordinarily relaxed atmosphere. Very welcome, I'm sure, to the veterans themselves. The trot of the light infantry. Detachment of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire light infantry representatives. But the trot is, of course, symbolic of the way in which Major Howard's men went into action. They charged across this bridge, firing from the hip. And as they come to the far span, they will pass the spot where Lieutenant Dan Brotheridge, who led a platoon and was the first man over the bridge, fell to a bullet, fatally wounded. Surely one of the proudest of proud moments in the history of British Army aviation. Well, if you can't march, you can keep time with your hand. Major Howard, obviously, in very good form and loving every second of it. sun shining down from a bright blue sky. Such a relief after the dreadful weather there was here yesterday. General Sir John Salmon Little will take the salute from the steps of the Gondry Cafe. Squad Sergeant Major WO2 Chalky Peters in control. And there's General Little, enjoying it as much as the veterans themselves. Beside him, Madame Arlette Gondry, daughter of the original proprietor of the cafe.
Major Howard, Madame Gondry Pritchard, Messieurs, Mesdames, bienvenue. It is a great honor and a privilege for me to be with you here this afternoon at this, at any rate for the British, I suspect the most famous of all the battle sites in Normandy. The story of the capture of these two bridges, but in particular Pegasus Bridge, and the heroism shown by men of the Oxford and Buckingham Light Infantry, of the Glider Pilot Regiment, and of the 7th Battalion of the Parachute Regiment is legendary. I recall Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory at the end of the war writing that the landing of the 3 gliders at Pegasus Bridge was, in his view, the finest piece of pure flying in the whole of the Second World War. We have come here today to commemorate this memorable feat of arms. We've come here today to renew old and strong friendships. But I consider most important of all, we have come here today to remember those men who died in this place or hereabouts, and to that end, later this afternoon and tomorrow morning, we all gather at the cemetery at Ronville. President Clinton said 2 days ago that your children, the children of your generation, and I was 3 when these momentous events took place, owe you an enormous debt of gratitude for making the world a better place. And the world is a far, far better place than it was in the early days of January 1944. On a personal note, I would like to say how grand it is to see Major Howard here and looking in very good nick. And also to Madame Gondry Pritchard, and Madame, on behalf of all your family, for all the kindness, generosity, and friendship that you have given us over all these years, since the very early hours of June the 6th, we are truly grateful. Thank you. But for you gentlemen on parade, this is your anniversary. This and tomorrow are your days, and I salute you. Come on, Jim. Up you come.
Jim Walwork, Major Howard's pilot, will reply to the director.
Ladies and gentlemen, Monsieur, Mesdames, I speak only on behalf of my regiment, the Glider Pilot Regiment. It was the last regiment raised by the British Army and the first to be disbanded. It was raised in 42, disbanded officially in 57, but faded away like old soldiers do in about 1947. A short, but far from undistinguished career. We fought in Sicily, the south of France, Normandy, Holland. We crossed the Rhine as a grand finale. We weren't only pilots, we were first-class infantry. And among the many battles in which we took part, possibly this one in Normandy stands out the most because we come here, the French make us so welcome, and we love it here. Thank you for listening.
And now we expect to hear from Madame Arlette Gondry.
Mon General and all glider pilots, it is my enormous pleasure to welcome you in front of Café Gondry, my home, Georges and Therese's home, and the home of all the veterans. I remember in particular the hard hours of the occupation as a little girl of 4, in the same way as I remember the few hours of our liberation. I'm enormously grateful to the glider pilots. I know how much it was hard. You were courageous, brave. You took on the responsibilities of going away with your gliders, carrying the troop, and you had many in them, the responsibilities of those lads and also of their wives and the children. And you knew you had those missions, you had to do it, and you did it. And you landed on the Normandy soil, unknown soil to you, not knowing whether you were going to be alive, and the rest of your comrades in the gliders. Those 2 bridges were taken intact, and what a marvelous operation it was. Of course, the officer in charge of that was Major John Hard, and I greatly appreciate what he did. But one must not remember that had not it been for you, the pilots, the troop would not have landed close to those bridges, and the Café Gondry would not have become the first house liberated, and I would not be here to say a few words to you. I have been asked to speak for 2 minutes. As an honorary member of the Glider Pilot Regiment, I wish to convey my grateful thanks to you, the pilots, for what you have done, and I wish to commemorate this special 50th anniversary with the rest that you carried in your gliders, the Oxenbachs, the engineers. The 50th anniversary was a team effort, and I am enormously grateful on behalf of my parents, on behalf of the Gondrys, for what you have done. Thank you very much indeed, and I hope we will have a very memorable commemoration this 5th and 6th of June, 1994. My love and affection to you all.
Well, now, Madame Arlette Gondry was, if she doesn't mind me saying so, a little girl of 4 at the time, but her father had had the foresight to hide 90 bottles of champagne. Oh, the Dakota drop. The last Dakota in service with the Royal Air Force, now serving with the Memorial Flight, dropping 18 very distinguished parachutists, all senior officers. And the first man out is Colonel David Parker, the regimental colonel of the parachute regiment. And these, remember, are not troopers. These are senior officers getting a bit of exercise. Well, as I was saying, when the Dakota came over, the father of Madame Arlette Gondry had the foresight to hide 90 bottles of champagne to celebrate the victory he never doubted would be won. He kept them hidden from the Germans, and when these men arrived, he decided that now was the time to crack that champagne out. I wonder how many of them can remember that.
With me now is Jeff Barkway, along with Peter Boyle, the two pilots from the third glider. Jeff, I just have to ask you, what was it like marching across the bridge now, 50 years after that fateful night?
I felt really choked. I really did. I didn't realise how people realised what we'd done. I couldn't speak on the bridge. It was fantastic. Fantastic.
Jeff, did you realise at the time just how important a mission you were spearheading?
We'd been told how important it was to hold the bridges, because if we lost those, then the airborne division would have been isolated, and possibly the German armour could have got across round behind the seaborne troops, and it would have been a very different story than the one it was.
Now, you've just landed in 3 Lynx helicopters. I was talking to a couple of the pilots yesterday who said landing there in daylight was pretty tight. How on earth did you land in a glider in the war in the middle of the night?
We were given 3 courses to fly by the Royal Air Force, and this is where Peter, my second pilot, came in. He had a stopwatch, and we cut loose, and it was on to the first course, start countdown on the watch. About 3 minutes, and he gave me a 3, 2, 1, turn starboard onto the new course. That brought us across the water obstacle of the river. We saw the big machine compartment of the bridge, both virtually at the same time. He gave me the third course. We turned onto it, straight into the field, and there we were, bang on the bridge.
Peter Boyle, as navigator, a heck of a responsibility that night.
Well, it seems today to be a responsibility, but quite honestly, in those days, we practiced so often that it really was just another exercise, wasn't it? It really was.
You sound very nonchalant. I can't believe that this night 50 years ago, you weren't just a little bit frightened.
No, I was very busy looking after Jeff, of course, but I found the fear came after the action. Is now over. I think it's the same in all actions like that, you're so busy that your mind is on one job, and you don't have time to be frightened, but you do after.
Here Madame Gondry is trying to get you over a glass of champagne now, but just before you go, Peter, your thoughts of landing here in a helicopter, how did that compare with gliding in?
Oh, so simple. I mean, an engine.
A piece of cake.
Piece of
cake. Yes.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. Do enjoy the afternoon here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that's the excitement and happiness at the bridge, but there's a lot of excitement out on the dropping zone too. Let's join Juliet Morris.
Hello, well, I'm here with John Vischer, who was a lieutenant in the 22nd Independent Parachute Company. John, you were one of the very first people to land here on French soil in the field behind us. Why did you come before the others?
Because the Pathfinders in the 22nd Company, was a Pathfinder unit, the 6th Airborne, had to mark out the dropping zones for the Challenger parachutists that were coming in, and then the landing zones for the gliders. And that was our job, the first job we had to do. So we had to have this done by the time hopefully the others arrived.
It must have been very frightening for you, wasn't it, knowing that you were going to be one of the first here, that you didn't have other men to back you up?
Well, it was too exciting, perhaps frightening, but very exciting, and a very exciting task to do. So it was really the moment of a lifetime, and you just wanted to do what you had to do, and the question of fright and so forth really went into the background at the time. There was too much to do.
Did everything go according to plan?
No, it didn't, but more or less.
In what way didn't it?
Well, I dropped on the wrong dropping zone, but that was a help to the people that should have dropped there because some of them were dropped a bit wide. But by and large, it worked out. The equipment was thin on the ground, but it got out the wireless transmitters and the Eureka lights just about in time for the main drops.
Good. Well, thank you very much indeed.
Well, the champagne is broken out at the bridge, and one of the many veterans who would have liked so much to be here today but couldn't make it, particularly for the champagne, would have been instantly recognizable. Having played heroic roles in scores of films, it may come as no surprise to his countless fans that the actor Richard Todd is himself an airborne D-Day veteran.
The first time I crossed this bridge, I was moving with a good deal more urgency and a great deal more hurriedly than I am at the moment. 50 years ago, I was 24 years old, and I, along with most of the others, had not seen action before. Now we were in it. And from the point of view of all of us, the object was to get across the bridge as quickly as possible, get to the other side, and get dug in somewhere, because the German counterattack was just beginning to gather force. And there was a lot of activity going on around here.
And I hadn't gone very far when I saw my first war casualty, and it was a German lying by the roadside. Just the torso, the legs had been blown off. Now, normally that would be enough to turn my stomach, but I don't know why it didn't then. I just looked at it, I just had a feeling of mild curiosity. You know, poor chap. And then I trotted on. Our orders were, as a battalion, that in the event of the bridges being captured intact, we were to establish a bridgehead on the far side of the waterways from the 6th Airborne area and hold until relieved. And that meant hold, stay there, whatever happens, because they were crucial, absolutely crucial. And it so happened that our little battalion bridgehead was on the main line of attack of 21 Panzer Division coming up from Caen. And they were quite formidable. So that this very lightly armed para battalion had only handheld weapons with which to face tanks coming up the road, which we managed to do successfully due to the enormous bravery of all of the men involved and jolly good leadership from their officers. I've been back to Normandy a few times since 1944. Each time I've always tried to find the graves of chaps I knew, because they're not all in the big airborne cemetery at Ranville. There are one or two in the little cemetery at Le Port, including Padre Parry's. Chaplain to the forces, the Reverend G.E.M. Parry, aged 29. Plessis Percy, the parachuting parson. Padre Parry was one of those men of God who obviously believed in preaching his gospel in pretty practical terms from the front. He was killed in the early hours of D-Day in the regimental aid post, where he was helping to tend the wounded, who were all shot where they lay by the Germans when they overran the aid post, but not before a few of them were taken out by Padre Parry himself, who apparently fought like a tiger from what we heard. Amongst the chaps who were there and killed was Private Gemmill, Parachute Regiment, aged 20. To the world, he was one. To us, he was the world. Each battalion had its own medical section, and our particular battalion had, our medical section was all staffed by Quakers, non-combatant Quakers. They wouldn't carry arms, but they were extremely brave and did terrific work under fire. And we admired them very specially because of the fact that they never carried a weapon. They had guts. There are certain things you'll never forget, certain sights, certain sounds,
the sight of destruction is the thing you won't forget. Villages absolutely smeared to the ground. Large towns like Caen, just piles of rubble. And the other thing that very few of us will forget was the awful stench of death that hung over this part of Normandy. Caen, where literally, I suppose, thousands of people were buried alive under the rubble, and long before they were retrieved and dug out. That was the stench of death.
Would you do it all again?
Yeah, I would. Just the same. Wouldn't change anything. Providing I survived, and I did, so I would do it all again, yes.